Novak Djokovic, the greatest men's player in history, publicly called out the Australian Open. And what triggered that? A 20-year-old girl from the Philippines standing on the wrong court surrounded by thousands of fans who never got to see her play. The WTA had one job, one match, one moment. They shattered all three, and the whole world watched it crumble in real time. Nobody puts a superstar on a 500-seat court and calls it coincidence. This was negligence. And when Djokovic spoke, the silence from tennis authorities became deafening. Before we talk about the chaos in Melbourne, we need to understand exactly who Alex Eala is, because that context makes everything that happened next feel even more inexcusable. Alexandra Eala did not arrive at the 2026 Australian Open as some unknown wildcard hoping for a miracle. She arrived as a revolution. The 20-year-old from the Philippines had spent the better part of 2025 rewriting every expectation ever attached to her name. At the Miami Open, she walked onto a hard court and dismantled Iga Swiatek, the world number 2, arguably the most dominant women's player of her generation, in straight sets. The tennis world froze. Commentators scrambled for words. Fans in Manila erupted in ways the sport had never witnessed from that nation before. She reached the semifinals of one of the most prestigious Masters events on tour, announced herself as a genuine force, and transformed an entire archipelago of 115 million people into a nation obsessed with women's tennis almost overnight. Then came the U.S. Open, another landmark, another border smashed. Eala became the first Filipino in history to win a Grand Slam main draw singles match. Not just the first woman, the first Filipino, full stop. In one forehand, one closing winner, one raised fist, she placed her country on a stage it had never stood on before. By the time January 2026 rolled around, she was ranked world number 49. Her trajectory had the trajectory of a comet, accelerating, blazing, impossible to ignore. Melbourne's Filipino community understood what was coming. Thousands of fans, many of whom had never attended a professional tennis event in their lives, bought tickets, booked travel, took days off work, packed their Philippine flags, painted their faces, and descended on Melbourne Park with one singular purpose: to witness history up close. The Australian Open knew this. The data existed, the ticket demand existed, the social media noise was deafening before a single ball was even struck. And yet, despite knowing all of this, the tournament scheduling committee looked at the most culturally significant women's tennis match on their entire draw sheet, considered the tidal wave of fan demand headed their way, and placed Alex Eala on Court 6. Court 6! Not Rod Laver Arena with its 15,000 seats, not Margaret Court Arena seating over 7,500, not even one of the larger show courts capable of handling 5 figures worth of screaming supporters. Court 6. A venue holding hundreds, not thousands, a venue designed for qualifying rounds, a venue built for matches nobody expected to matter. They scheduled the biggest cultural moment in Filipino sporting history on the smallest stage available. That decision, made in some air-conditioned office far removed from the passion building outside, would set off a chain of events that reached all the way to Novak Djokovic's press conference microphone and shook tennis to its foundation. Monday, January 19, 2026, Melbourne Park, the Australian Open, first round. Long before Alex Eala struck her opening serve, something extraordinary unfolded outside Court 6 that no tournament official had prepared for, because no tournament official had apparently considered it possible. The queue stretched back to Rod Laver Arena. Read that sentence slowly. The line of fans waiting to watch a first-round match on a minor court extended all the way back to the main stadium, the beating heart of the entire complex. People stood shoulder to shoulder in the afternoon heat, many having traveled from interstate and internationally, many holding signs they'd spent days creating, many wearing Eala jerseys, Philippine flags draped over their shoulders like capes. The scene outside Court 6 on that Monday afternoon was described by journalists as astonishing, by fans as heartbreaking, by Navratilova, tennis legend Martina Navratilova, as a flat-out mistake by the organizers. Because when the gates finally opened, they couldn't accommodate what had accumulated outside them. Hundreds of Filipino supporters, people who showed up precisely because they believed in this moment, believed in this player, believed that for once the sport had delivered someone who represented them, stood on the wrong side of a fence, watching a screen, wondering whether anyone in power had ever thought about them at all. Tennis fans across the globe watched footage of the Court 6 overflow, the endless queue, the locked gates, the fans on screens, and reached the same conclusion with striking unanimity. Something had gone profoundly wrong. Not accidentally wrong, negligently wrong. Putting Eala on Court 6 is just dumb, one widely shared post declared with blunt precision. Another voice, louder, more pointed, directed blame beyond the tournament organizers. WTA should have done their research better. They know Eala's appeal and should have pushed for a better stage. A third cut straight to the verdict. She should easily have been on an arena court. One comment, perhaps the most resonant of all, captured the full weight of the failure. Definitely. I feel so sorry for Filipinos who have probably never been to tennis and will miss out. To make this mistake once is dumb. To ever do it again, unforgivable. Unforgivable. That word appeared repeatedly in threads across Twitter, Facebook, and tennis forums. A community that had only recently discovered the sport through one extraordinary player was being handed its first experience of institutional indifference. Meanwhile, a separate debate ignited about the behavior of the fans who had gained entry. Umpires had reportedly intervened during play because sections of the crowd, unfamiliar with tennis etiquette, passionate beyond restraint, cheered mid-point, celebrated opponent errors, and created noise while the ball remained in play. Critics called it disrespectful, classless, a breach of the sport's sacred culture. But Filipino voices responded with a question of their own, one that cut straight to the heart of something much larger. That is how we celebrate and support one of our own on the world stage. Why conform to the standards of people from other countries? That question hung in the air over Melbourne Park, unanswered, uncomfortable, impossible to dismiss. Then Novak Djokovic stepped to a microphone. 2 days after Eala's first-round exit, the 24 Grand Slam champion, freshly victorious in his own third-round match, was asked by a reporter about the crowd situation surrounding the Filipina star. He didn't deflect, he didn't offer diplomatic non-answers, he addressed it directly with the calm authority of someone who has stood on the biggest stages in tennis for 2 decades. I saw the other day with Eala, yeah, that's been the talk, which is understandable. There are some players coming from respective countries, like she's coming from the Philippines, which is now a big deal. She's been the biggest ever tennis player from that country, which is a big country, and there's a big interest. So things like that happen. Then came the line that mattered most. You could argue that it was maybe a poor schedule, and maybe they could have scheduled her on a bigger court. Novak Djokovic, arguably the most credentialed voice in the history of professional tennis, had just publicly called the scheduling decision poor. Not ideal, not suboptimal, poor. The establishment had been given a verdict it could not ignore. When an institution makes a catastrophic error and the greatest player in the history of the sport calls it out publicly, the appropriate response is swift, unambiguous accountability. What the Australian Open delivered instead was a social media post. The tournament's official response to the chaos, to hundreds of locked-out fans, to Navratilova's public criticism, to Djokovic's pointed observation, to the viral footage seen by millions worldwide, amounted to a brief acknowledgement that they would learn for next year. No formal apology, no compensation offered to fans who had traveled and been turned away, no direct acknowledgement of the scale of the institutional failure that had occurred. The WTA's response was even more remarkable in its absence. The body responsible for advocating on behalf of women's players, including rising stars whose commercial and cultural value extends far beyond tennis's traditional markets, offered nothing substantive. No statement expressing regret that one of their most commercially significant young players had been placed on an inadequate stage, no public reflection on whether their scheduling input had failed a player who deserved better. The silence spoke. It spoke to a deeper truth Philippine fans had suspected, but now felt confirmed: that tennis institutions built their structures around familiar markets, familiar faces, and familiar audiences, and that players from nations standing outside those structures were expected to be grateful simply for being included, not demanding regarding how. Eala had achieved something unprecedented. She had converted an entire nation, 115 million people, most of whom had never watched a WTA match, into devoted tennis followers. She had walked into one of the most storied venues in the sport and generated crowd demand that tournaments spent decades attempting to manufacture artificially. She had done the WTA's marketing job for them without a single dollar of institutional support, purely through the power of her talent and story. And the reward for that commercial gift was Court 6. Online, the backlash deepened and broadened. What had begun as anger about a scheduling decision evolved into a wider conversation about structural bias, about which players received resources, visibility, and institutional advocacy, and which did not. About whether Asia-Pacific players, despite their growing fan bases, were still being treated as supplementary attractions rather than central box office draws. The etiquette debate added a painful dimension. Filipino fans who had cheered passionately, some of them experiencing professional tennis for the first time in their lives, found themselves criticized online by viewers who apparently expected a community handed its first sporting hero to immediately absorb decades of cultural protocol. Eala herself absorbed the entire weight of all of it: the pride, the loss, the locked gates, the controversy. She was 20 years old, speaking to reporters after a first-round defeat, attempting to make sense of something no athlete should be asked to process alone. She said, "I'm still young, 20, so learning to handle all of this attention. I guess this is one of the moments I can reflect on what this means for Philippine tennis." She carried that burden with grace the institution had failed to earn.